Good afternoon, class. In this brief video, I'm going to be reflecting a bit more on Descartes' foundationalism, the notion of certainty, and some things to consider when trying to figure out whether he was successful in his foundationalism and to what extent he was successful, if you feel that he was. Now, this is in response to a discussion question, which is basically that question. Evaluate Descartes' argument, and do you think he was ultimately successful? Now, when I say ultimately successful, I mean in proving the existence not only of himself as a thinking thing, but of the external world. If we recall from the beginning, when he begins the first meditation, he takes three examples of people who experience doubt, or three rather phenomenon in which causes him doubt. The first is he notes people which he just refers to under the general terminology as insane. These are people who are sort of walking around the streets thinking that they, according to him, are clothed in nice clothes and are of noble birth, but in reality they are naked and not. And he says, well, how do I know that I am sane and not sane? So this is the first doubt he has. And the second one is probably the most notable. That's the one that that's the doubt about him dreaming and experiencing a form of reality in a dream and thinking and being convinced that that is reality, but then waking and realizing that it's not. And the third point of doubt is the evil genius. He says, what if there's some evil genius that has not only deceived me as to my perceptions, but as to the very concepts I use to perceive reality? And that could be quantity, quality, things like this. And so when we say ultimately successful, how does he alleviate all of these doubts? And in through meditation 1 through 6, he does have a method for doing it. Most everyone noted that after he goes through these three series of doubts, he does arrive at meditation 2 with the cogito ergo sum, or translated, I think, therefore I am. And so he establishes himself as a thinking thing. Because when he tries to doubt, he realizes that he can't doubt that he's doubting, and doubt is a form of thinking, and therefore he is a thinking being. But he still hasn't figured out how to prove the external world. So when we note that his idea is foundationalism, that is the foundation. That is the one point he can't doubt. He can't doubt that he's not doubting. So his foundation is that he is a thinking thing. So then we move to, how do we get from a thinking thing to that everything in reality really exists, that these are actual books on a shelf, that the shelf exists, that the body that people are in exists. How do we get to the external world from just the thinking thing? And the second step in this foundation is that he attempts to prove the existence of God through an ontological argument. One is made in meditation 3, and the other is made in meditation 5. So the next point is, if he is successful, is he successful in actually proving the existence of God? And so one point to consider is, he has proven that he's a thinking thing. Most people agree with that. Some don't. Kant will later challenge that. But before he can get to proving the external world exists, he has this step in between, which is that God exists. And if you don't feel that he successfully proves that God exists, in the same way that he proves that that he himself exists as a thinking thing, then we might ask, well, was he successful, right? We all get the logic for how he can't doubt that he's doubting. Is there a similar method that he uses to prove that uh, God's existence is true with the same level of certainty? That's the other aspect of the argument. Is it the same level of certainty? And he uses an ontological argument. he thinks to himself, how am I most convinced that things exist? And he thinks because they're clear and distinct. Then he reasons that the most clear and distinct concept he has in his mind is the concept of God. He realizes that this concept is infinite. And he says, well, how did this concept come into being? And right now he's only dealing with the reality of thoughts. And how do we get this one substance of thought? How do we get it to form? Well, we need some type of formative agent, and this formative agent has to be infinite. He reasons because the concept itself is infinite. So whatever form this concept, this infinite concept, has to itself be infinite, and he understands himself to be finite, so he couldn't have done it. And therefore, he finds that the only type of thing that could have formed this concept is something at least as large as that concept, which would be infinite. And therefore, he gets his first proof for the um, existence of God. Now, he does then import more ideas, such as that this God would not deceive him. And this again, we would ask, is he as successful here? So he has this idea that this God would not deceive him, while at the same time he realizes that deceptions occur, right? Sometimes we see things and we see things incorrectly. And so he attempts to explain how we can have certainty when we see things. So far we have that he thinks, therefore he is, that God exists, and that God would not deceive him. At the same time, deception occurs. And in this latter step, he understands the will to be infinite of the human being. And in this sense, it's like God. But he understands the intellect to be finite. And when one's will supersedes or goes beyond one's intellect, mistakes can be made. But if one sort of does not allow their will to move beyond their intellect, then he finds reasonable assurance that he will not be deceived. So then he thinks about objects and he says, well, one of three possibilities could occur. Either the objects exist in the external world, my clear and distinct concepts of the objects. Uh, um, those objects either exist in the external world, I'm creating them, or God's creating them. And he thinks to himself, well, which one seems most natural? Which one seems as though it exists or it is so? And he lands on the idea that it seems as though the objects exist in the external world. And he sees that because he can't sort of recreate reality just with a thought, right? If you see a certain thing in front of you and you imagine something different, the thing doesn't transform. Rather, it would appear as though that object is actually in reality. And then sort of moving back to a past premise that God would not deceive, he says, well, since it seems like that, then he gives adequate justification for the existence of objects in the external world. But this has a foundation that goes from he thinks therefore exists to God does not deceive to objects exist in the external world. Now, a possible problematic aspect of foundationalism is if you remove one of those pieces. Suppose you remove the piece that God exists, then you can't be certain of anything after it, according to the sort of structure that Descartes has. And this is different from saying, oh, I believe that God exists. That's not what he's trying to prove. He's trying to show with certainty that God exists. And so he gives an ontological argument that God exists. Now, we might consider later on, a few decades later, Hume proposes a different reason for why we have a concept of God. Right? So we have Descartes' explanation for why we have a concept of God, and that's that God exists. Hume thinks, for example, that it is more likely the case that what we've done is we've just taken the concept of a human mind, of a human being, and we've made these finite qualities infinite. And our imagination can do these things. Just because we can think up a concept doesn't mean it exists. And if you're more persuaded by that idea, then we can't move past that first step or that first foundation. We can't build on it any longer, according to Descartes' structure. So these are some ideas to consider. In order to say that he's ultimately successful, we have to sort of say, oh, we see in a very compelling way, almost to the sense of certainty, that each step is accurate and compelling in the same way the first step was, which seemed very compelling. Um, if we don't find them as compelling, then we have to say, well, he's not ultimately successful. He gets us to a certain point that we're a thinking thing, but that doesn't do much good when sort of reflecting on how we know anything about the external world. We have to evaluate each one of these steps. So this is the what we might call the debatable merit of the epistemological position of foundationalism, particularly of Descartes' foundationalism. So I'll post this video into Canvas. If you have any questions or reflections on it, feel free to email me or post a message on Canvas. Hopefully this helps to further clarify and facilitate reflection. Thank you.